committee, when we were thinking about, the different keynotes we had, I was like, well, we have to have Jonathan. We have to have Jonathan Rosa, who is Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Education, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and by courtesy, the Departments of Anthropology, Linguistics, and Comparative Literature at Stanford University. So you can see he's very disciplinarily promiscuous. He's also the director of Stanford's program in Chicano Latinx Studies and co-director of the Center for Global Ethnography. He has written a plethora of academic articles. The best ones are co-authored with me, of course, but he's also the author of the award-winning book, Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, Racial Linguistic Ideologies, and the Learning of Latinidad. And we're also excited to hear what he has to say about Bad Bunny, because he wanted to do that. He wanted to write about Bad Bunny. It wasn't that I begged him to do it, no.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Yarimar. Thank you, Kimberly, Cristel, and the entire Centro team for all of your work in organizing the symposium over the last few days. It's incredibly meaningful for me to have the opportunity to be here presenting. In this location specifically, my father grew up, was born and raised nearby in Morningside Heights after my grandmother migrated from Puerto Rico to New York in 1945, where she eventually became the president of the Spanish-speaking Tenants Association in the Grant Houses, very close by. And my sister, who is here in the audience, has a forthcoming book on housing politics called Precarious Constructions with the University of North Carolina Press. So it's cool to have the chance to be here with you all today. So, full disclosure, I am here first and foremost as an anthropologist, not a fan. I see myself as a participant observer of you all in many ways. I take very seriously the significance of Bad Bunny, his resonance as a political figure and as a sort of popular cultural representation. I'm interested in how he has been an advocate for Puerto Rico in response to a range of significant challenges after Hurricane Maria, in the context of various political and economic unrest. And as an ally or a purported ally in response to LGBTQ plus movements in various ways. And so I have been paying very careful attention to Bad Bunny as a celebrity, a commodity figure of certain forms, but also as someone who people are inclined to invest a great deal of meaning into. And so I'm much more interested in what people need Bad Bunny to be than I am in who he is as an individual person. So I take my cue in my thinking about celebrity from my close colleague, Vanessa Diaz, who is here today. And Vanessa tells us that when we're paying attention to celebrity, we have to focus on the labor that produces the image of celebrity rather than just the object or the product on the other end of this work. And she tells us that we should pay very close attention to the politics of visibility and invisibility. And we should not mistake visibility as power. We should not mistake, we have to be very critical about the ways that we think about what is being visibilized and invisibilized. Vanessa says, how is it that we often know more about celebrities than we do about many friends and neighbors we see in person every day? So I want to issue a little bit of a cautionary note about the familiarity of Bad Bunny, and to ask what other forms of familiarity we are moving within, what kinds of community we're creating or not creating. Vanessa says, we expect to have access to all personal details of celebrities, broadly defined. Access to this intimate information has shifted our own notions of community and our general discourse, with information about these personalities becoming the default conversation starters for many people, the shared imaginary community. And so organizing around celebrity and building community around celebrity has profound potential in some ways. It also has profound pitfalls. Vanessa says celebrity media production manufactures personalities that people feel they know and can relate to. And so I want to not take for granted the resonance of Bad Bunny for many of us. That's a manufactured product in many ways, and I want to think critically about that resonance across spaces. But don't worry, I'm not just a hater, I swear. I'm interested in bringing a critical lens to some of what might seem to be deeply sorts of contradictory representations associated with Bad Bunny. On the one hand, he's been associated in some ways with trans, queer, femme performances and enactments of various sorts, and on the other hand, with cis het mask performances and enactments in many ways. And so I want to think about the ways that we often imagine one side of this to be deeply transformative and the other side to be deeply normative, but I see normativities and transgressiveness across these spaces in many ways. Note that even in his recent performance at the Met Gala, which people heralded in many ways, the backless number that he wore, it draws on a deeply binary orientation to gender in many ways, at the same time that it performs a certain kind of transgressiveness. And his participation in WWE events, largely associated with certain forms of masculinity. I mean, girl, these are deeply queer spaces. So let's think more critically about where we locate normativity and where we locate transgressiveness, and let's bring a critical lens to these various spaces. I suggest that in order to do so, we should take heed from scholars who have taught us how to bring careful readings of these texts, of these performances, of these situations. I think with Jose Esteban Munoz's thinking around disidentification. And so what is the work involved in developing disidentificatory readings of Bad Bunny? Munoz says disidentification is meant to be descriptive of the survival strategies the minority subject practices in order to negotiate a phobic majoritarian public sphere that continuously elides or punishes the existence of subjects who do not conform to the phantasm of normative citizenship. And I want to suggest that in the reading of Puerto Rican subjects, this kind of an analysis that pays careful attention to non-normative citizenship is absolutely crucial. And we can't afford cynical readings. We need readings that find deep possibility, and Munoz offers those to us. He suggests disidentificatory performances and readings require an active kernel of utopian possibility. Although utopianism has become the bad object of much contemporary political thinking, we nonetheless need to hold on to and even risk utopianism if we are to engage in the labor of making a queer world. And so I want to bring this kind of disidentificatory analysis to discussions surrounding Bad Bunny. I've been especially interested in discourses about Bad Bunny as someone who is not crossed over, someone who is imagined as embodying a certain kind of authenticity and leading this new movement in some ways. And I want to think about the ideologies associated with crossing over or not crossing over, the imagined authenticity that someone is thought to embody in some ways. And I want to think about the stereotypes surrounding authenticity: purity, realness, truth, reliability, authenticity as a brand in some ways. I also want to think about stereotypes about ambiguity, mixedness, dissimulation, dishonesty that are often reproduced through ideas about who is authentic, who embodies a certain kind of authenticity. So this notion that Bad Bunny is this authentic, non-crossover artist, I'm interested in giving a disidentificatory reading to that, the ways that, in fact, certain norms are being reproduced, certain imagined purities are being reproduced that we should be really careful in our thinking about. So let's look at some representations of his alleged non-crossoverness. Quote, this is in the recent Times story. Or Times interview, or Time, sorry, not the Times. Bad Bunny is perhaps the world's first reverse crossover artist whose success comes from a refusal to cater to the mainstream. His stubborn originality, independence, and fiercely local lens have made him a radically new kind of global pop star, etching pathways to success that completely bypass New York or Hollywood industry gatekeepers. So here he's imagined as embodying some kind of realness, of a deeply Puerto Rican vernacular realness on some level. And I want to, again, think critically about that. What is reproduced? What imagined pure thing is being reproduced through someone like Bad Bunny? And how is it that it has become commodified on a certain scale? I'm also deeply interested in the ways that stereotypes about language figure centrally in these notions of Bad Bunny as someone who hasn't crossed over. So Benito has achieved all of this without releasing a single song in English or making any real attempt attempt to cross over. Other Latin artists have scored mega hits in Spanish. Richie Valens' La Bamba back in 1958, Los Del Rios' 1993 hit Macarena, Luis Fonsi's Despacito in 2017, but US interest has ebbed and flowed with subgenres like Latin pop and reggaeton, a genre that blends Jamaican and Latin musical influences with hip-hop elements, dismissed by industry insiders as fads. So here, Bad Bunny's use of Spanish is imagined as a clear sign of his authenticity. So it's an unambiguous sign of a non-crossover artist. He is a user of Spanish, he hasn't switched to using English. But I want to, as a linguistic anthropologist, it's always my duty to inform people that we need to think about language in much more careful ways. So we often think, for example, that translation is an act of crossing over pre-existing boundaries. Remember, the translator has to reproduce those boundaries in order to act as a translator in the first place. A translator needs a boundary, needs a border, and has to reproduce it and rely upon it. So I want to think about, just in the way in which a translator reproduces a boundary, how could not crossing over transgress a boundary? So how could we disrupt some of our assumptions about this? And these ideas about crossing over are informed by a range of thinkers, especially Jackie Alexander's pedagogies of crossing. And Alexander, who is a queer, Afro-diasporic, feminist thinker, suggests pedagogies of crossing is intended to disrupt inherited boundaries of geography, nation, episteme, and identity that distort vision so that they can be replaced with frameworks and modes of being that enable an understanding of the dialectics of history, enough to assist in navigating the terms of learning and the fundamentally pedagogic imperative at its heart, the imperative of making the world in which we live intelligible to ourselves and to each other. In other words, teaching ourselves. So Alexander is teaching us, or suggests that we need to learn how, teach one another, how to not reproduce certain essentializations, how to not rely upon certain boundaries, even as we produce visions of possible worlds, possible futures, how we often fall back on essentializations. And Alexander wants to help us to think beyond those. So taking my cue from Alexander, in my talk today, I'm really interested in stereotypes surrounding racial, ethnic, and linguistic boundaries and borders, and the kinds of authenticities and ambiguities associated with them. I'm interested in how Bad Bunny is imagined as embodying a particular kind of racial ambiguity and a particular kind of ethno-linguistic authenticity. And I want to challenge us to rethink our assumptions about the objects of ambiguity and authenticity, and to read in a disidentificatory way ambiguity and authenticity anew. So let's start with racial ambiguity. So if you are interested in social media discourses surrounding Bad Bunny's racial identity, like I am, because you choose violence on a daily basis, you see that Bad Bunny is clearly a white man. It's obvious from some perspectives. You also see that he clearly is not a white man, and people wondering why the internet would suggest that he is. You see other people claiming he's clearly Habao. I don't know enough about Bad Bunny's personal life, but he's a Habao. Light-skinned, black features. Here, blackness is a feature, not a color. And I want to think about the semiotic ambiguity of these concepts. He has light-skinned privilege. That's why I see this as colorism. When Calderon started wearing his hair in locks, some folks lost their shit. That's straight up racism. So you see a distinction between colorism and racism. Let's think with that. Y'all call him Bad Bunny, how about just not to call him white? Call him mestizo then. Stop whitewashing the definition of habao, which is we gotta scream this out, a very obviously black person who happens to be pale. That is not the same thing. And so you have, just like a differentiation between whiteness and blackness, a distinction between what is truly someone who is habao and not. And I as much as I want to call into our attention all of the contradictory debates, there's a lot at stake in these distinctions. Tremendous violence is enacted on people on a regular basis based on these kinds of stereotypes, and yet we act on them as though they were straightforward, self-evident, continuous, and so that's what I want to draw our attention to. Then, of course, his romantic practices and intimate practices are a focus of attention, and our modalities through which his racial positionality is discerned. So his dating practices, who he is seeking out as for partnership. So just like a typical Latino boy who sees some form of access or possibility that Vanessa was teaching us about earlier. And this one is especially interesting to me. On the one hand, the claim that Cardi B is a white Latina, and on the other hand, someone saying, we live in a world where people call Cardi B white and Bad Bunny black, I'm logging off forever. Busquen these. So one of the challenges with these stereotypes about race, this came up in the previous discussion, is the way in which there is often a deep kind of destructiveness that can emerge around them, at the same time that these kinds of debates are very important for various reasons because of the vulnerabilities that can be experienced in relation to physical appearance. And so how do we articulate those vulnerabilities without falling back on essentializations? That takes a lot of work. It takes a pedagogy of crossing and a disidentificatory reading, and I want to show you how. So part of what's going on in these representations is they set up a range of subsequent conversations about Bad Bunny as someone who is appropriative, as someone who is mainstreaming into a particular kind of Latinidad, a whitewashed Latinidad, and becoming a white Latinx artist, or perhaps from some perspectives, he always was a white Latinx artist, and then some claiming that it's appreciation and not appropriation. And remember, of course, in these debates, as we've been discussing over the last couple of days, this has come up many times, appropriation and appreciation often hinge on these stereotypes about authenticity that I want to continue to draw our attention to. Now, this is related to a broader set of discussions about the politics of Latinidad and race, the question of whether this category is an ethnic or a racial category, whether Latinos should be understood as a minority group, the assertion that this group is obviously an ethnic category, not a racial category, the notion that race can't just be discerned through physical appearance or phenotype or skin color, this question that despite all of the heterogeneity among Latinos or Latinxes or Latines, that this is a coherent category. And some people are just sick of the discussion altogether. Part of what is, again, I want to affirm the effort to reject a homogenizing Latinidad, a homogenizing representation of Latinidad, at the same time that we need to be careful about reinscribing and essentializing assumption about race and ethnicity. So the notion that Latino is an ethnic category, not a racial category, because Latinos present physically in such distinctive ways, absolutely Latinos present distinctively in a whole range of ways. So do Asians. So do white people. So do what we imagine as normative racial categories, blackness, indigeneity. There's tremendous heterogeneity in each of these categories, so that can't be the definition of what constitutes race or ethnicity. We need to think beyond what Fields and Fields call a racecraft analysis, and they warn us about our attention to identity instead of power, and the way that this fixation on categories leads to endless debates such that we can end up with Cardi B being framed as a white Latina, that at some point make no sense and can be weaponized against anyone, even the person who is imagined as most authentically embodying some category. And we have to take risks. These are the risks that Munoz is asking us to take. These are the risks that Jackie Alexander is asking us to take. And it's not easy work, but it's the work that I see as our responsibility. Part of the work of disaggregating Latinidad involves attending to anti-blackness among Latinos, involves attending to a range of Latino, intra-Latino heterogeneities, thinking about these categories of whiteness and whether Latinos are white, should be understood as white, are being incorporated into the United States, like previous waves of European migrants to the United States, and then some people, again, just reject these sorts of frames altogether. So part of what we see is a shift to a specificity, a specific attention to the power of anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity in the US and across the Americas, and the significance of these forces, these violent forces to the foundations of these societies and to contemporary realities within them that have placed newfound Latinidad as a concept under newfound scrutiny. And some people suggest that we need a revision of Latinidad and we need to rethink how it has been incorporated and institutionalized. Some people suggest that we need to cancel it altogether and get rid of it. This is challenging. I have to say, as someone whose research on the ground has been rooted in Latinx communities, where Latinidad has been central to people's survival in those communities, I'm troubled by some of these frames at the same time that I respect and take very seriously the ways in which Latinidad can be institutionalized as a harmful force, as an exclusionary force, as a project of anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. How do we take seriously Latinidad as a project of survival in some circumstances and violence in others? What kinds of readings do we need? In order to do this work, part of what people have been paying closer attention to is how even in efforts to affirm Black solidarity among Latinos, it's in some moments, slogans such as Latinos for Black Lives Matter are experienced as a reiteration of an exclusion of Blackness from Latinidad in the first place. And so how is it that a range, again, of pedagogies of crossing are required in order to learn how to re-articulate some of these relationships and experiences? Now, this has placed someone like Bad Bunny under newfound scrutiny in recent years, where his silence in the context of recent racial justice protests has led for demands of statements from him. And as we've been discussing again over the last few days, his comments have been regarded in many cases as inconsistent, as homogenizing, as disappointing, locating himself within Blackness in some ways that people find to be disingenuous, equivocating racially in other ways, and being translated in ways that obscure how he draws potentially on stigmatizing stereotypes about Blackness, even as he tries to articulate a form of solidarity. So what do we do with the messiness of Bad Bunny's discourse? Do we demand that he just learn the script? Is that the end point? That you should articulate race in one way, that you should separate race and ethnicity, that the definitions of these terms are straightforward, self-evident, and that once you learn them, then we end up in a better world? Or does the project of justice require something much more of us? There have been also recent discussions about Bad Bunny is, of course, part of a much broader set of color evasive practices and stereotypes and ideologies within reggaeton, within Latin America more broadly. And Bad Bunny's recent commentary, which again has come up over the last few days, has largely been regarded as, again, his evasiveness of racism. At the same time that on the cover of the Time magazine story in which this interview appeared, he invokes and performs Betances, himself an object of racial discourses, of racial ambiguity. So Bad Bunny's lack of discourse of spoken discourse is complemented in some ways or works in concert with a different set of performative techniques where he embodies and enacts Blackness. What do we do with this? Where people are embodying and enacting practices that are legible on one level or not in another level, deeply contradictory with one another. What pedagogies, what disidentificatory interpretations are necessary in order to honor the complex inheritances, racial, diasporic inheritances of various populations? How do we honor this without reproducing either essentializations or obscuring concrete distinctions in people's vulnerabilities, the everyday realities that people are navigating? What do we do? So I want to contrast these discussions of Bad Bunny's racial ambiguity with his ethno-linguistic authenticity. Often, people have invoked that, this idea that Bad Bunny is the first of many things, in many cases in relation to the Spanish language. This notion that he is the first Spanish language performer to be nominated for various awards, to win various awards, to sell records at certain rates. And so his Spanish language prowess and distinctiveness is often circulated, or discourses about this, and this has positioned him as an icon of linguistic justice. So this is a clip of an interview which took place in English at the American Music Awards, where Bad Bunny unabashedly says, "I don't understand what you said." And so he's been regarded as someone who openly is addressing this position of linguistic marginalization and the expectation that you should speak English in certain spaces. And I take very seriously the stigmatization of various populations and the ways that Bad Bunny could be understood as connected to these populations. At the same time, that I also want to think carefully about this discourse that separates the Spanish and English languages and suggests that they are fundamentally apart from one another. So that his Spanish language songs have broken a chart record, "Raise Your Moscow Mule." which is the name of one of the songs, which I thought was going to be sort of a satirical reference to the reality that English is central to Bad Bunny's Spanish, is central to Puerto Rican Spanish in many ways. Puerto Rican Spanish and English cannot be separated from one another linguistically, are deeply intertwined with one another based on histories of colonialism and violence. And yet no reference to English is made. So these English forms and patterns that Bad Bunny is using, they exist very comfortably alongside the idea that he is not a crossover artist and he only uses Spanish. The album that's the #1 album, El Último Tour del Mundo. And so English is everywhere if you're paying attention in Bad Bunny's language use, and English is everywhere in Puerto Rico if you're paying attention in different ways that aren't always perceivable to someone who is not necessarily articulating or engaging in a particular set of disidentificatory interpretations. And so I want to think through those interpretations. In that album, the best-selling song on the album, Taquiti, opens with the word baby, which is contrasted with bebé later in the very same phrase, where he uses English forms and Spanish forms, but is only heard as speaking Spanish. Party is in the song. Parqueao is in the song, so you see these English loans that are incorporated into Spanish syntax, and then you get como piercing in the song as well, using English gerund forms and English conjugations. And so it's a deep, intimate familiarity with English that no one recognizes. And I want to think about how race is recognized, racial ambiguity is recognized, and that ignores certain things, and how Spanish authenticity is recognized, and how that ignores certain things. What's being obscured? Perhaps my favorite example of this is pe fucking ere. It's a beautiful example of a particular set of linguistic patterns. So you can't just put fucking anywhere in a word. So when you say abso-fucking-lutely or fan-fucking-tastic, that has to go in a very particular location, syllabically. So it's a process called expletive infixation. And so it's an expletive that's infixed into a word, and it depends on the syllable that is most stressed in the word in English phonological patterns. So pe fucking ere requires a knowledge and an enactment of English phonology in order for it to make sense. It makes no sense apart from English phonology, but English phonology makes no sense apart from Spanish phonology for Puerto Ricans. So these live together intimately in ways that we haven't learned how to recognize. What mode of disidentificatory interpretation, what pedagogy of crossing is required to learn how to recognize these realities that are all around us? So that's the English grammar rule you didn't know you knew. Now you know. So if he knows how to say pe fucking ere, then he knows English. He knows English phonology intimately out of a history of colonial violence. And to not know that is dangerous. Now I'm also interested in the way in which at the same time that Puerto Rican Spanish for Bad Bunny in certain moments is framed as an object of authenticity, is something that allows him to embody this non-crossover status. Puerto Rican Spanish itself is often a target of attacks for its authenticity, and the notion that you don't go to Puerto Rico to learn good Spanish, that Puerto Rican Spanish is in fact made impure by the English language. It's been infiltrated by English. And frankly, that what is hiding under these stereotypes is anti-Blackness. So you've got language varieties in the Caribbean associated with French, with Spanish, with Dutch, that are all framed as illegitimate varieties of those languages based on anti-Black, linguistic, racial, colonial stereotypes that are deeply intertwined with one another. So based on our recognition of these dynamics, I want to think about what's at stake in the notion that singing or speaking in non-English, what's going on in this kind of a representation. So on the one hand, I take very seriously the ways that this can be a stigmatizing frame, although I'm inclined to pay attention for closed captioning for deaf audiences and for disability or disabled folks who have been demanding captioning and subtitling and have sought to have their particular needs recognized, and those have often been ignored, and yet this particular moment was framed as this problem that required immediate response in ways that often disability does not. I'm also interested in this framing, again, of any language other than English as a not language, so that English is the only language. So, you know, in the United States, this is an upside-down reality that we have inherited in many ways. And so I think about this in terms of what I've described as ideologies of languagelessness. These are racialized stereotypes that frame particular populations as incapable of producing any linguistic variety legitimately, and Puerto Ricans are often framed as illegitimate users of Spanish and English. And I've heard many Puerto Ricans say to me that they don't speak any language. These ideologies of languagelessness become institutionalized in deeply harmful ways. You have millions of families in the United States who between 1980 and 2010 were classified as linguistically isolated because they didn't self-identify as speaking a language as speaking English very well, on a scale of very well, not at all, which meant that millions of households that were users of many languages were still regarded ultimately as linguistically isolated because English is the only language that matters from some perspectives. I should say, Ana Celia Zentea, an important mentor and a long-time collaborator of Centro, was someone who led the charge to have the Census Bureau remove that categorization of linguistically isolated. And we worked closely on that effort. But these ideologies of languagelessness take many forms. You have thousands of children in Los Angeles Unified School District who've been classified as non-nons. These are kids who are said to be nonverbal in either English or their so-called native language. Virtually no human child is a non-non linguistically. This doesn't prevent mainstream institutions from classifying kids as such in ways that become deeply harmful, that relegate kids to remedial education for the entirety of their K-12 experience. The category recently that has been created in the last 15 years, long-term English learner, which another close collaborator and colleague, Ofelia Garcia, has been bringing very careful attention to. This category, long-term English learner, is used for kids who have been designated as English learners for 6 years or more and still haven't passed the reclassification assessment for English language proficiency. The majority of kids who are designated as long-term English learners were born and raised in the United States, and English is the primary language they use, yet something about their English is framed as not good enough to be eligible for mainstream learning opportunities. And so I take very seriously, on the one hand, the way in which this notion of speaking non-English can be deeply stigmatizing and punitive. I also want to think about how Bad Bunny is winning in non-English, according to Yanimar, and the ways in which his linguistic unintelligibility can be commodified and made profitable, and not knowing English in a certain way makes him into a particular kind of form to be consumed and circulated. And so I want to be careful about how we make sense of his linguistic authenticity, just like I want to be careful about how we make sense of his racial ambiguity. Each ambiguity and authenticity are not facts about objects, they're reflections of political realities, and they deserve much more careful analysis than we've been giving them. Okay, in conclusion, I want to suggest that part of my concern here, I want to think with Bad Bunny, as the symposium has suggested we should do, and stop ignoring Puerto Rico. I also want to be very careful about only attending to Puerto Rico through the lens of celebrity, through the lens of crisis, through the lens of humanitarianism. And I'm concerned deeply about the ways that Puerto Rico has suddenly come onto the radar for many people as an object of philanthropic investment, as an object of scholarly analysis. Many colleagues who have been conducting research in Puerto Rico for decades report now that communities they've been collaborating with have been saturated by scholars who are seeking to remap the archipelago and to understand its realities from a deeply recolonizing positionality and stance and perspective. So I want to be careful about how we attend to Puerto Rico, and I want to think about what mode of analysis, what mode of observation would allow us to engage in this kind of disidentificatory interpretation of Puerto Rico, and what pedagogy of crossing, what mode of learning is required in order to offer that kind of interpretation. This, I think, for us, requires rejecting trends and paying attention to how even This week, the Supreme Court's decision rejecting the legitimacy of the ability of Puerto Rican journalists to access documents that La Junta has been using to organize the Puerto Rican political economy, that is a federal imposition on the archipelago, a colonial federal imposition on the archipelago. It reenacts the insular cases that stipulated more than 100 years ago that Puerto Rico belongs to but is not part of the United States and is a colonial possession of the United States. And so if we only engage in an analysis of Puerto Rico that is attentive to it in these trendy terms, we miss what's going on in a much broader perspective. And in conclusion, I want to again revisit Jackie Alexander, who says, "This, then, is the existential message of the crossing, to apprehend how it might instruct us in the urgent task of configuring new ways of being and knowing, and to plot the different metaphysics that are needed to move away from living alterity premised in difference to living intersubjectivity premised in relationality and solidarity." I want to suggest that we owe this to each other. We need this from one another. Much more careful readings, much more careful critical engagement. Nothing more nor less is at stake in that than our collective survivance. Thank you.
Jonathan, so what are you saying? So Bad Bunny's English is not a pure English. Bad Bunny's Spanish is not a pure Spanish. So we get that. We know he knows how to say pe fucking r. His mom was an English teacher in Puerto Rico, by the way. Don't know if that influenced. But so I think in the New York Times piece that you put me up there, so I'm in the mix. You know, what I wanted to say was that, like, what for many Puerto Ricans, we've been told our English is impure, our Spanish is impure, and we've always felt some kind of way about that, right? And so he takes that stigma and makes it feel like a flex instead of a failing, right? And I think a lot of people identify with that, I have found, like even non-Spanish speakers, you know, especially like a lot of BIPOC folks, they're like, oh, you know, I like how he's pushing back on this, you know, and they see also a kind of rejection of respectability politics and all of that rolled in there. And his vulgarity is part of this impure Spanish as well, right? This is not the Spanish of the Royal Academy, right? And the fact that he has been awarded prizes for his songwriting and everything. Some people in Puerto Rico are like, what? And when he was featured on the first Spanish language cover of Time magazine, I saw people on social media, right, saying, bueno, pues I guess that's a good thing, but there are so many other people who deserve it more than him, right? Because of this polluted, vulgar, street Spanish that is also, like, the understanding of that as not proper Spanish also is invested with class ideologies and all of that. So where do we go from here? What you saying, baby boy? What you saying?
You tell me. No, so on one level, I want to agree with everything you're saying in the sense that I've been worried when people have said, oh, Spanish is just a colonial language. We owe each other much more careful analyses of what these practices become in diaspora through colonial histories of survivance, where, again, out of necessity, various populations, colonized populations, have repurposed these practices that have been hegemonic in various ways, that have been part of advancing colonialism and made them into something else, have repurposed religious practices, you know, aesthetic practices, linguistic practices, and otherwise. And so, you know, I don't just think Spanish is a colonial language, it's much more than that. What even counts as Spanish is Castilian, right? So we're talking about a whole internal situation in the European context that's also buried in this elevation of one variety in the nation state that has come to be called Spain, which has tremendous linguistic heterogeneity itself and is this kind of space of debate. So I think that there is a lot at stake in recognizing how transgressive his performances in different spaces have been, standing on that red carpet and saying to that interviewer on national TV, I don't understand what you're saying, and not having to go through this gauntlet of being cleansed, being someone who's perceived as having been cleansed of an accent or cleansed of Spanish in order to be able to participate in particular spaces. The concern I have is the way that certain forms of, I think there's also something about his linguistic practices that reveal that I worry about this exceptionalization of particular categories and practices. I think they reveal the fundamental indeterminacy of language. English is a Germanic language, you know? So many histories are buried under what comes to be elevated as this coherent, singular, unified whole. And so I want to be cautious about exceptionalizing him because I think he has much more to teach us if we could learn. I don't think he knows what he has to teach us. So I don't want to attribute it to him personally. No, and that's not a dig.
Thinking with him has so much to teach us.
I don't need him to be able to say, oh yes, it's it's expletive infixation. It's a penthesis. The syllable stress is here. You know, that's not what I'm looking for from him. But I think we can learn more than just. And here's the other part of the concern. There's often this idea in language and social justice circles that all we need to do in the United States is champion linguistic diversity and assert the Spanish language, and then that's the path towards justice. Well, dual language schools have been gentrifying the Spanish language, appropriating it, where middle-class white children and wealthy white children are learning Spanish and making it into a particular kind of commodity, where Latinx kids, racialized Latinx kids, socioeconomically marginalized Latinx kids who grow up using English and Spanish face perpetual educational stigmatization and remediation. And so this notion that we just need to champion linguistic diversity, I worry about that. And that's my concern. We need to focus on power, not just the language itself, because Spanish can be commodified just as much as it can be an enactment of a progressiveness. And so that's what I want to attend to here.
So Cristel and I have been tracking how Benito's Spanish, his very Puerto Rican Spanish, his slang, but also his Spanglish, right, has come to be set the kind of tone for what reggaeton should sound like, what lo urbano should sound like, is being appropriated by artists from Spain, is being, but there's also been like a lot of Puerto Rican comedians, etc., who now find that they are more legible to broader audiences. And so what do we make of that? Is that a commodification? Is that, what does that teach us?
That's the indeterminacy part. That we are under this ideology that language is just this matter of these words. And if you know the definitions of the words, then you understand that language is a social practice. And we don't understand each other very well ever. But we're under the impression that in some cases we have this very clear channel. That language works perfectly, and in other cases you have these truncated, repertoires or abilities. But I think this indeterminacy in stand-up comedians, what stand-up comedy isn't like playing off of a form of linguistic indeterminacy and cultural and ideological indeterminacy. Now, his performances have made that ritual possible, but it's not just about language, it's about the ritual of being able to sit in that uncomfortable space of not feeling like you understand something entirely, which in the United States, a lot of people have not been willing to do. It was a deeply fascist, space in so many ways, where we like to be able to maintain the idea that we're only using English. I mean, I always use the example in my presentations of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer who detained two Mexican women in Montana in a gas station parking lot for speaking Spanish publicly. Note Montana derives its name from montaña because Spanish preceded English in that space. Of course, indigenous languages preceded Spanish and English, but it's not that Spanish isn't there, it's that people like the idea that it's only one language that's in play, but multiple languages are always in play. Again, we just don't know how to sit with that in different ways. So that's I want to invite people to deal with all the shit I have to deal with ideologically. I want people to have to, if all of this is so complicated to me, I want it to be complicated for everybody. That's my life's mission.
We just want to sing and dance and have fun. No, we're here to be serious. So let's talk a little bit about Latinidad. You said you wanted to get complicated, so.
That's where I draw the line. Cancel it.
Sorry. Now, well, first, I want to hear a little bit more. You had this like really provocative line about how people for whom Latinidad is a survival strategy. I want to hear more what that means, and how do you also a comment that Vanessa had made earlier that I've heard as well of all these journalists asking us. Why him? Why now? Like, why is the U.S. ready for this Latino artist? And I know that you've written about like Latinos being seen as like the people of the future, all this stuff, while also being banned. And you know, there's currently a whole new border crisis emerging post-COVID, et cetera. So how do we reconcile that American celebration of Latinidad, that like we're now ready for this Latino artist that can just sing one song at the Grammy and completely change captioning practices for live performances, while also, you know, all these kind of strategies of survival that you're pointing to as well?
Yeah, this plays off of, I think, something that came up in the immediately the session right before this one and throughout the conversation over the last couple of days, which is pluralizing Latinidades and recognizing that if you take a vernacular kind of perspective or bring a vernacular perspective to Latinidades, I think about Milagros Ricord and Ruby Danta's book Hispanas de Queens, where they offer this frame of convivencia diaria, living together daily, and the ways in which, out of necessity, working class, often impoverished women who have migrated to the United States from various Latin American locales have seen themselves in one another based on shared experiences of racial, spatial, and class exclusion. And that's not to say that there aren't tremendous differences among them that take various forms, and yet they're experiencing something collectively. And for us to ignore the significance of that, I think is dangerous. Ramon Rivera Cervera's book, Performing Queer Latinidad, he offers a frame of frictive intimacy to make sense of intra-Latinx relations and how it is that there are these frictive dynamics where populations have seen themselves in one another. That's what a disidentificatory interpretation, it's a mode of performance and of interpretation and production. That's how Munoz frames it. And this sense that people have had to see themselves in one another. You know, there's a lot going on my campus right now around questions about the category Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, and the so-called Mexican hegemony. The ways that Mexicanness becomes the reference point for Latinidad broadly in certain contexts and populations that are marginalized in relation to that. And again, I want to take very seriously those experiences of marginalization. I want to take seriously critiques of the ways in which Chicano politics in certain moments can be exclusionary, has been troublesome. I also want to take seriously Chicanidad as an effort to name systematic forms of exclusion that people were facing, didn't have language for, and generated language for, however imprecise. And I feel a responsibility to protect that and honor that. I'm not Mexican, but I feel like I feel a responsibility to that. I'm interpolated as Mexican and made interchangeable with Mexican colleagues in various ways, who then people are saying Latino is not a racial category. Okay, sure, it's not but what is truly a racial category? And I worry about and again, I don't want to say that dismissively. I understand why people are invested in particular frames of particular definitions of race. I also want to caution against an essentializing orientation, because if you end up starting with the categories, which is what Fields and Fields call racecraft, rather than power, then you misunderstand vulnerability, and you will presume that categories and vulnerability always correspond to one another. We live in a nation state that has been inhabited, whose echelons of power have been inhabited by racialized people who have advanced empire in the most nefarious of ways. Our current Secretary of Defense, our current Vice President, who is a woman of color, who is a daughter of migrants, immigrants on both sides of her family. Within the first 3 months of office, she went to Central America and said, "Don't come." And that didn't contradict her woman of colorness, her black womanhood, her Asian, South Asian womanhood. That enhanced her stateliness. And so once you recognize that racialization and empire can co-articulate very comfortably together, you have a serious responsibility to think beyond how we're assuming how vulnerability articulates. And I want to take that really seriously. And so for me, the Latinidad, and I'll get to the future question in a second, the Latinidad thing, you know, I think that critiques of the institution of Latinidad, and Arlene Davila has written very powerfully about this, you know, the commodification, the whitewashing of Latinidad. Absolutely, let's bring careful attention to this, while at the same time recognizing these vernacular practices of survivance in which populations have engaged out of necessity. I wrote a book about it. So I'm invested in that, even if it's not a categorical investment. I'm not narrowly invested in Latinx, whatever name, and all the debates about naming, you know, and people sort of see Latinidad as being in crisis. And I say, oh, so you think gender isn't a problem for other categories? They've got that worked out? You know, gender egalitarianism is going well for populations that aren't debating whether to say Latin A, O, X, A. No, it means that Latinx is a site of contemporary debate. And we should take that seriously, but not in ways that exceptionalize Latinidad. And it's dangerous to exceptionalize it because we let power off the hook for everybody collectively, and we're responsible for one another. That's what Jackie Alexander teaches us. So the question about futures, yeah, the people of the future are, you know, Brazil is the future, miscegenation, mestizaje, it's disgusting. I mean, it's deeply, deeply troublesome, these sorts of imagined racially mixed futures in certain ways, which ignore all kinds of contemporary realities, historical realities. I'm also concerned about the ways that these discourses of the future are used, and this is what I've written about, to reproduce contemporary exclusion. So if you're only ever a population of the future, a rising demographic, then how do you state claims to rights and resources in the present moment? The idea is you're not quite here yet. Wait for your moment. And is your moment here? This kind of thing. And I'm interested in how the circulation of a popular cultural figure can be used as a cudgel to sort of say, you've got this, so who needs immigration when you've got Bad Bunny? Who needs, comprehensive immigration reform when you have a popular cultural figure to invest in? And that's this is part of what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. How do you think the different ambiguities that you laid out, his racial, gendered, linguistic ambiguities play into each other? And also his political ambiguity, because Puerto Ricans are always already American in a way, right? And they're not impacted by the border crisis. They're not impacted by these other things in the same way. And I wonder, given you're looking like a language, sounding like a race, analysis of how people speaking in Spanish is a kind of immediate racialization, to what extent is his speaking in Spanish a way of kind of racializing himself and dealing with the whiteness of the urban genre and who gets to succeed in it? Would he have been seen the same way if he was singing in English?
No, I think it's important to kind of understand. This is why I try to sort of not think about any of these categories as objects in themselves. Once you make language or race or gender or sexuality or class into these sort of demographic variables or categories, then you misunderstand how power and governance are structuring them in relation to one another. So I think, for example, about the ways that C. Riley Snorton writes in Black on Both Sides about histories of trans Black experience. Snorton says, my goal is not to think to combine Blackness and transness, but rather to create a frame in which Blackness and transness never could have been understood apart from one another in the first place. So Snorton suggests, citing Du Bois's framing of double consciousness as two souls in one, striving in one. How is it that Du Bois was articulating transness and Blackness, but it's only Blackness that is understood as part of that Du Boisian formulation? And so similarly, I'm interested in attention to how citizenship, language, race, these stereotypes that look like they're separate, these realms that look like they're separate, how they get governed collectively and how they structure one another. And I think, again, it requires this really careful analysis. Yes, there's a book that I won't name, because I'm not feeling shady today, that suggests that what distinguishes Puerto Ricans and Mexicans is the politics of citizenship and labor, and that Puerto Ricans experience citizenship privilege and Mexicans experience labor privilege. I'm like, it is, is hard for me, that particular analysis. Because Puerto Rican citizenship, from my perspective, has been central to Puerto Rican disposability and marginalization. That is a form of second, third, and fourth class citizenship. You know, Puerto Ricans citizenship was imposed upon Puerto Ricans non-consensually through the Jones Act just in time for World War I. And Puerto Ricans served in disproportionately high numbers in World War I and in every subsequent U.S. military incursion. And so I worry about this idea that, that if you look at citizenship apart from colonialism and governance, you miss how citizenship is articulating. If you look at labor apart from exploitation and migration and the ways in which particular populations' presence and their labor is predicated on a particular form of exploitation and marginalization, then you think that they're just experiencing privilege. And so this does require a careful political, economic analysis.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was just, my brain is exploding right now. It was really awesome. And also, thank you for mentioning my work. That was like a I can die now moment, so thanks, I appreciate that.
I had to read every chapter of that book.
So there were a few terms that you brought up throughout the talk that stuck with me and kind of resonated. So my question is kind of a little bit loosey and more like I'm kind of interested in for you to say a little bit more. And those words are visibility and invisibility, because you talked about that in the beginning, and then embodying and enacting, and legibility and illegibility. And I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how you're thinking about those terms in relationship to what you said at the very end, race, language, the celebrity, and like sort of trendiness around Puerto Rican Spanish, around Puerto Rico. And it made me think about Ana Celia Zendaya actually put me in touch with a New York Times reporter recently who's working on a piece about Puerto Rican Spanish. I think I might have mentioned it to you. And he wanted to speak with my students in my Bad Bunny class because what he's interested in is how people, because of Bad Bunny, have been demonstrating more interest in either Puerto Ricans learning Spanish who didn't speak Spanish, or non-Puerto Ricans, other Latina identified or otherwise, want to speak Puerto Rican Spanish. And in fact, some of his research showed that he reached out to some of the language apps, and that there was a demand for people wanting to learn Puerto Rican Spanish. There's different non-Puerto Rican TikTokers and Instagram celebrities who like to post videos of themselves speaking their very practiced Puerto Rican Spanish, not Puerto Rican people. So that to me linked to this question about visibility, invisibility, legibility, illegibility, and this trendiness and this celebrity and this caution that you're kind of bringing up. So I know it's a little bit loosey, but those terms all came together for me and were really evocative. So I don't know if you want to offer anything on that.
Hi, thank you. I guess I want to point back to Alyssa's comment earlier today, because I think we all laughed at it, but I took it very seriously about reggaeton in the Anthropocene. Just because I think, since you mentioned futurity, I guess where would Bad Bunny fit within that, or Puerto Ricans fit within that, and then making it in a more broader picture, where would Latinos fit within that contextualization of reggaeton in the Anthropocene, and then maybe connecting it to language learning right now, because I think a lot of people see themselves learning Puerto Rican Spanish, but they don't see themselves interacting with Puerto Ricans. So that's also something. And they also want to learn a very specific Spanish, because what Spanish from Puerto Rico are you going to learn? Every time I speak in Spanish, people look at me weird, and they're like, "Tú eres del campo, nadie te entiende." So that's also important to me as someone who moved from Manatí to San Juan, and everybody was like, "You sound Colombian," and I was like, "No, I don't." But la pregunta básicamente, how does, I guess, all of this fit within a greater, what's gonna come next?
I didn't know I was talking about the Anthropocene. All right. I renamed that the Raciopocene. Vanessa and I wrote an article on that, so you got to check that out. It's called Raciontology. But anyways, Vanessa, your question makes me think of Frances Aparicio's a chapter that she wrote 20 years ago titled "Of Spanish Dispossessed." And she looks at the ways that U.S. Latinx kids have systematically had Spanish taken from them in different ways. And I always hear Nelson Flores in my ear talking about Spanish is not an object, you can't dispossess it, but Nelson, whatever, I'll fight you on that. So we could disagree. We could disagree. We'll talk, yeah, we could debate. I'm sure you are. But I take Nelson's his cautionary note seriously, which is be careful about making Spanish into an object to be owned. And that's part of my point as well here. So I think about the kinds of marginalization that particular populations have faced through, the use of the Spanish language at the same time that it's being commodified for particular people. And my question would be, which Puerto Rican Spanish? There are many Puerto Rican Spanishes. And so it flattens out tremendous heterogeneity in Puerto Rican Spanishes. There are many diasporic Puerto Rican Spanishes, many archipelagic Puerto Rican Spanishes. And so we should be attentive to all of that profound diversity that gets, I think, flattened out in its commodification in different ways. And that would be something that I would want to think about in terms of which varieties are circulating. What, the linguistic so, if you really want to nerd out, I don't know, I've got like three people in the audience who care about this. But the linguistic anthropological concept that I'm obsessed with is enregisterment, which is to say, which features of which varieties of which languages are elevated to an emblematic status. So why is the aspiration of S? Why is the trill of an R? Why is glottalization? Why I always felt like my father when he would say either Gilbert Rosa was his name or Gilberto Rosa was his name. I was like, two different people are in the room. And it felt like there are different models of personhood that get constructed in relation to these features. But there are infinite features that we could be paying attention to. Which ones attract attention, become objects of ideology, and which models of personhood get constructed around them? What Puerto Rican is imagined as being embodied by the variety that is being desired right now? So it's something that I would think about. In terms of the Anthropocene, Lord, I think of Nick Estes's book about indigenous experiences and Native American experiences. Our history is the future. And there's a way in which, precarity, again, the exceptionalization of environmental, political, and economic precarity in Puerto Rico, I think obscures the way in which, these kinds of infrastructural vulnerabilities are taking place across broader context in New Orleans and Flint, throughout, the United States and various racialized and socioeconomically marginalized communities. And to me, the challenge with the Anthropocene, and I've been reading too much Donna Haraway lately, but I worry that by always focusing on this future crisis, this coming future crisis, it prevents us from recognizing what is happening right now. The disposability, the required, I live in San Francisco. I can't tell you how jarring it is to experience the intimacy of disposability and accumulation and hoarding. They live in quite comfortable relation with one another in that space. And so I think, and fascism isn't, this is why I worry about, discourses of rising fascism or discourses also of evolution, these ideas of these processes that are not completed yet, and there will be a moment when they pass this threshold when they should truly become actionable. And I think that prevents us from attending to them right now, in this moment, and to recognize the profound disposability. And I think, the United States is a scary place. 1 million people plus, during COVID, right? And you're talking about a deeply class-based form of disposability, and I have to, if I'm being real about the discourses of cancel Latinidad, while cohorts of Latinx marginalized populations were being canceled by COVID through death, that to me, literally canceled, was scary. The disconnect between social justice discourse and the vulnerability of communities based on the labor positions and the ways that the racialized nature of labor, because of our fixation on identity, we aren't able to recognize race, how it articulates in various ways. That's scary to me. And so I think we've got to develop tools for recognizing the vulnerability that exists right now, not just in this kind of anthropocentric sort of future or something like this.
So, hi, Jonathan. As a dual language teacher, I'm really interested in how Bad Bunny is used in dual language spaces as a way of connecting to students, as a way of connecting to students with bilingual identity and Latinx identity. What possibilities and problems does introducing him as an icon or as a staple in dual language classrooms have? And the other question is, Michael DeGraff has talked about how Creole languages are often racialized because of the people who speak them. For instance, Afrikaans isn't seen as a Creole language of Dutch. I'm wondering how the various Spanish languages from the Caribbean are situated in these discussions and how we can sort of benefit from being considered as part of these Caribbean languages that are distinct from their European counterparts.
Wow, that's a wonderful.
Doing the work in Zoom.
Lord have mercy. Zoom did not come to play today. Okay.
Man, maybe this is too reggaeton specific, but I was also thinking while you were talking about and the question of commodification and all of that, like what is it? So there are two parts. One is thinking about Alyssa's presentation about Medellin, and like when Nicky Jam says part of his rebirth of his career is that he sings and talks now like a Colombian and not a Puerto Rican, and that's softer and more romantic. And then also thinking about what is the biggest up-and-coming scene in Latin urban right now is Argentina. And I mean, there are some of them that I really like, okay? But what's interesting to me is I just keep wondering what's gonna happen with like the language, right? Because
I need a seatbelt.
I don't know. I just want to know what you think about Argentina and reggaeton and language of race and empire in like 3 seconds.
Oh my God, not the Southern cone in the room.
You want to embrace Latinidad, toma.
Oh my God. There's violence that lives here.
Intimate violence.
Intimate violence. So first off, dual language schools. So, you know, part of what is so frustrating about language learning as it's institutionalized in the United States is the way that it misrepresents the linguistic skills that so many communities bring to school with them that are reframed as pathologies, as problems to be fixed and overcome. And so you have all of this tremendous linguistic dexterity waiting to be connected to educational opportunities, to learning experiences. And to the extent that engagement with Bad Bunny, that's why someone said earlier that their kid doesn't know, you know, the elementary school students don't know what bicho and chocha mean. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. You know, I think that these, you know, and there's something to be said for the lack of meaningful education about one's body and about desire and about intimacy in our schools and the policing of these kinds of knowledges that are fundamental to who we are in relation to ourselves and to one another. And so to me, yeah, to the extent that engagement with Bad Bunny becomes a learning opportunity or a way to validate, a way to recognize, again, these forms of linguistic dexterity, absolutely. You know, the issue for me is when we often end up incorporating these kinds of practices into schools as not as legitimate sites of knowledge on their own terms, but rather as starting points from which to learn real school knowledge. And instead, I want to suggest that, you know, these aesthetic practices, you know, these forms of music and dance are sites of profound knowledge that we need desperately, that has survived, you know, histories in various ways. And so, I'm excited about the learning opportunities around that. The question of, so Michel de Graaf's work was invoked. Michel is a Haitianist scholar, well, a Creolist linguist. And Michel's work I really appreciate this point that attention to what counts as a Creole or a so-called pidgin or a so-called language, those are not facts about language, or a dialect. Those are not facts about language. Of course, the classic sociolinguistic adage is that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So to the extent that a set of language practices are backed by political and economic power, they will be elevated to the status of standard legitimate language. That is not a fact about language, and it's really important for us to kind of to recognize all of the inconsistent ways in which certain practices, and this happens with Latino Latinos all the time, and with Puerto Ricans and users of, I say users to recognize multimodality, sign languages, spoken languages, reading, listening. These are all communicative practices. Users of Caribbean language varieties are often framed as fundamentally illegitimate. Indigenous language users are often framed as users of dialects, not languages. Yeah. Those are not facts about language is so profound as a phenomenon. This is where I start to proselytize, sorry.
Preach.
Yeah, but language is too important. It is one of the most important things that we have as a species, to the extent that we want to make sense of ourselves as a species. It's such a crucial social, cultural, historical practice, you know, and to reduce it to the few category labels that we have available and to think that those are what language is so much more than that. And so I think de Graaf's work points in that direction. The question about the Southern Cone, shit.
Not escaping it.
And Nikki Jam's rebirth through Colombia, Lord. Okay, so, you know, I want to be careful about pigeonholing Nicky Jam because I don't know the exact details of his rebirth, but I know some of them. And, you know, I want to think about the ways that his access to recreating himself might have involved some form of solidarity, some form of finding oneself, some disidentificatory practice in Colombia that wasn't available for him elsewhere for whatever reasons. I would want to hold open space for that. You know, I never thought I would talk about holding open space for Nicky Jam on stage. So.
I want to kind of thank you for your invitation for us to wade complexly. And I think it's not an accident that the two folks invoked that we're invited to read with are both of Caribbean heritage, right? Munoz being Cuban and M. Jackie Alexander, forgetting her particular heritage. Trinidadian, yeah. Trini. And yeah, I'm interested in your kind of invitation to think about this particular quote, relationality, solidarity, and kind of a discussion point we've been having about the attribution of credit. So if we're thinking with Bad Bunny, and this is perhaps related to the earlier question, which I presume is also an educator, and I'm thinking here with my students, particularly with my queer students that I see in my classroom who I teach Bad Bunny with, and how they use his aesthetic to find a path to articulate a queer self, whether or not he identifies as queer or not. And how do we suggest, or how do you suggest perhaps using these tools to do a critical reading of artists that are so enmeshed in industry, but at the same time, you know, how do we hold tension to perhaps be reinvested in ways to dismantle or lift perhaps the semiotic veil of power? And yeah, I'm interested in how you might invite us to hold tension when we're doing these types of readings, right? And not perhaps dismiss my 18-year-olds, right, that see Bad Bunny's dangly earrings and that reads queer to them, and then they're able to kind of articulate a type of self who are then dismissed by that being the reference that they take, right? So how could we do a reading that helps us look at types of tension?
Yeah, so I've been working really hard on my discursive. You talk about lifting the semiotic veil, so let's lean in. I've been working on thinking about the frames that I try to experiment with to discuss and to think with these kinds of issues that I think you're speaking to, and I've tried to really work on my use of conjunctions and the use of but as a conjunction and shifting to and. And there's a way that but as a conjunction ends up negating what came before it. So someone is doing this, but there's this other thing, rather than and, which is these things are happening simultaneously. That this person might be engaging in an act that we could understand as appropriative, based on a frame that is trying to honor the work that went into producing that practice and the community context in which it emerged. Appropriation can be a useful frame for speaking to that. It can also be a frame for essentializing who owns something and narrowly defining what that thing is. And so how is it that you honor the context and the reality and the experiences that produce a practice and the possibilities for their meaningfulness, for people to find meaning in them that wasn't necessarily the initial reading. So, this kind of openness, I think, is required of us. It takes tremendous work, though, and care in order to sustain those analyses simultaneously. And I don't mean to project a shallow oh, I didn't realize this quote was still on here. Oh my God. Oh my God. There's a thank you slide. Yeah, I don't mean to project shallow narratives of solidarity and say, we're all in this together. So there should be a thank you slide.
No thank you.
All right. I worry that we can be just like Bad Bunny when they interviewed him and asked him about race, and he was really quick to say, we're all the same blood. We all share the same blood. And what does that tell us about our differential vulnerabilities? So just being too quick to jump to that solidarity or unity without acknowledging simultaneously differential vulnerability is dangerous. But it's also, I said but. I'm a work in progress. I know, I'm a worker. I know, this is a drinking game now. Once you open these things up with this one, it's very dangerous too. What is the work? This is that work that I think I was trying to think out loud about. What is the work involved in attending to these different dynamics simultaneously? It takes careful work, and I worry about the ways that we have come to a place through the DEIification of race and gender and sexuality and class and fill in the blank, color, I call it the Sherman-Williams, Roy G. Biv analysis of identity and categories, where it's like Crayola or the Crayola, where let's just give a label to everything, and once we memorize all the right labels, then we end up with justice. And I don't see that as the path. I think it's dangerous. I think it's scripted. I think that it often is embraced in elite contexts. I think it's a deeply neoliberal individualist project. I think it's divorced from our political economic realities and our vulnerabilities. I think we've got to do much better than that. And often, my concern is many colleagues have defaulted to this. Colleagues who I expect more from in their analysis of these dynamics. And so I feel a responsibility. Why earn tenure if you're not going to be risky? And so I have to take these risks to say things that need to be said.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for taking risks, for holding space for Nikki Jams, for gifting us a new drinking game.
But
that was an amazing conversation, and now we get to celebrate. But before that, I do want to ask everyone to help me in thanking the Centro team for all their hard work. Yay! We've had like data scientists serving tacos and doing all sorts of things. I want to thank our communications team, our tech team, our arts and culture team, and just everyone at Centro who has been here supporting us and supporting the live stream and supporting all of this.